My name is Ezra Finch. I'm 27 now, and there are nights I still taste the cheap diner coffee I poured into a paper cup the first week I lived out of my car. If you'd told that kid a decade ago that he'd inherit Walter Finch's entire estate, $3.5 million, he would have laughed until he cried. Mostly he cried, because laughing felt dangerous when the people who were supposed to keep you safe had already packed you out like trash. Growing up, our house smelled like lemon cleaner and performance. My mother, Linda, smelled of hairspray and consequence, and my father, Robert, smelled of aftershave and numbers. They polished the lawn on Sundays and polished my sister Maeve into the kind of angel that reflected well at dinner parties. She had trophies, a scholarship, and a smile that never creased. Me? I had paint under my nails and books tucked in odd places. I asked questions. They called it attitude. I wanted to become whatever I wanted to be. They wanted me to be a headline they could brag about. When I turned 18, the house turned into a stage. They sat me down like it was rehearsal and told me I was being toughened up, that if I was still under their roof at 18 I was a failure. So they failed me first. No money, no courtesy, no see you someday hollow promise. I walked out with 2 shirts, a hoodie, and a soundtrack of their laughter threading behind me. I slept in the back seat of my car that night, and I learned, the hard way, how small a person can feel when the only family you think you have chooses to erase you. There was one exception. My grandfather, Walter. He smelled like tobacco and blueberry pie, and he never pretended. He called me easy and let me crash on his sagging couch. He'd feed me stew thicker than his accent, hand me a pocketful of quarters for laundry, and tell me, over and over, that my stubbornness wasn't a flaw. It was a ledger of quiet resilience. He saw things my parents couldn't or wouldn't. He'd listen to me talk about canvases and night shifts and somehow make me believe that survival was a skill I was building, not a sentence I was serving. Fast forward 10 years, I carved out a life that smelled of ramen and overtime and rented curtains. It was modest, honest. Maeve would Instagram a new house, a new bag, a new smugness. Linda called only when she wanted dinner plans or the warmth of my presence when it was convenient. Robert went radio silent until something profitable surfaced. Then one phone call split my world open. Walter was gone. Grief hits like bad weather, unexpected, cold, and unrelenting. I went to the house expecting a folded photo, maybe a watch he'd picked up on a whim. I walked into an oak-paneled room that smelled of old money and older regrets. Linda had lipstick sharp enough to cut. Robert had his hands folded like a chess master. Maeve scanned me like inventory. The lawyer, Mr. Hale, cleared his throat and read the words that made my heart become an animal in my chest. Walter Finch leaves his entire estate to his grandson, Ezra Finch. If time has a pause button, that was it. For a second I felt him there, a sly grin in my memory, like he'd filled the will with payback and love in the same ink. My parents froze, like actors whose lines were suddenly missing. Maeve's jaw opened. Then the room filled with a noise I knew well, the sudden, practiced sweetness of people ready to rip a wound open. Of course we'll help you manage it, Linda cooed. Money is dangerous without guidance. Robert leaned back and folded his fingers into a triangle. Large sums can ruin people. We can oversee. They weren't offering help. They were setting a net. The lawyer kept reading because Walter had been thorough. No trustees. No oversight. The estate is to be controlled solely by Ezra Finch. His eyes dropped to me. There it was, Walter's last, private defiance. My parents smiled like blades. After the reading, they began to rearrange things, voices soft, words like concern and for your own good thrown about like confetti. Maeve leaned in and said, with that same practiced pity, you don't want to be one of those people who blows everything in a year, do you? She said it like a verdict. Robert called me son like a checkmark on their moral ledger. Linda patted my arm so hard I felt the print of her ring against my skin. I didn't answer. Why give the story any more momentum? That night, the world cracked open in ways I'd expected but wasn't prepared to face. The bank called me a week later. There were attempts to access Mr. Finch's accounts, the teller said. Someone tried to present as your representative. I drove past my parents' house that night and watched the porch light glow like a liar's promise. I felt an unfamiliar thing, not longing, not sadness, cold, clinical focus. They had moved from cruelty to active theft. From there, it snowballed. My car came back with a long, angry scratch. My landlord emailed about anonymous noise complaints at 3 a.m. I watched neighbors' smiles tilting into something sharper. Friends stopped calling. Rumors have a way of multiplying. My name became a rumor's latest currency. I was a headline, undeserving grandson. The air tasted metallic with betrayal. I sat across from a stack of bills one night and realized the truth was not about the money. It was about the story they wanted to write about me, penniless, irresponsible, grateful for whatever crumbs they tossed. I was tired of rehearsing the role they'd cast. I dug into a drawer and found an envelope I'd almost forgotten, a letter from Walter, written in his slow, stern hand. Ezra, it began, the world won't hand you anything it can take. Don't let them take what's yours. One day you'll have to show what you're made of. I read it until the ink blurred because I needed to hear him say it again. The days after that were procedural and ugly. I fought the rumors, submitted documents, talked to lawyers who smelled like leather and small-town politics. My parents escalated to whispers, insinuations, an attempt at bank fraud that thankfully failed because the bank, used to theater as well as I was, flagged the request. Maeve showed up at my apartment one evening like she owned the place. Perfume, stilettos, and the same old script. You're going to need a house, she said, as if I'd never learned to breathe in a small room. Let us help you look. We've got connections. She plopped on my couch, eyes already costuming my future. I closed the door slowly and listened to the air move around her. Entitlement, obviously on loan, they tested me in ways I didn't expect. The city was a theater and they were critiquing my performance from the cheap seats. I could have given in, signed the forms, let them steer the helm. It would have been easier. It would have also been surrender. Walter hadn't left me a map, he left me a choice. Here's where things turn. Anger is a poor architect, strategy is better. I started documenting. Not for revenge, not at first, but because truth is weighty and needs proof. I recorded conversations, kept emails, saved every threatening text. I talked to the bank in person, showed them the will, and asked them to flag any suspicious activity. I hired a small legal team. I did the thing my younger self had been mocked for. I planned. Quietly. Patiently, then came the night I waited for them, the night I let their hunger show its teeth. I invited them to Walter's old house under the pretense of discussing the estate. I had a recorder in my pocket and a stack of questions on the coffee table. I watched Linda's face as she tried to sell me the facade of family reconciliation. Robert did the math in his head and swallowed his conscience. Maeve flirted with the idea of free funds and the fantasy of a life that never had to be earned again. Let them talk. I let the camera catch the exact moment when greed swallowed their civility and they started plotting out loud. It was ugly and hypnotic, the way people you thought you knew suddenly dissociated into intent. We should be trustees, Robert whispered. We can manage the properties, Maeve chimed in. Linda nodded like a woman rehearsed for applause. They thought they were safe. They weren't, but here's the twist, and it's the part people don't expect in stories about inheritance and retribution. I didn't press charges. I didn't call the tabloids. I did something stranger. I asked them to look at what they'd done and tell the world they were sorry, to Walter, and to me, on camera. I wanted truth more than I wanted punishment. At first they laughed. Then they panicked. Then they tried to bargain. They promised apologies, rehearsed remorse, even phony tears. I let them perform. I recorded everything. But I also did something else. I signed the papers that turned Walter's estate into the thing he always was in life, a small, stubborn engine for helping people like me. Half the money went into a foundation, the Finch Resilience Fund, scholarships and emergency grants for kids kicked out at 18, for artists sleeping in cars, for anybody whose family mistook them for a scandal. The rest? I kept a modest amount, bought a small place with paint on the walls and sunlight in the morning, and started renting studio space. I didn't keep enough to change who I was. I kept enough to be safe. When I told them, when I read the new plan aloud in their living room, the faces that had once calculated profit now scrabbled for dignity. They tried to call me naive, a fool. I smiled because being free of their control felt like the cleanest kind of indignity. I had the money. I could have played them at their own game. Instead, I used their ambition as fuel for something that would outlast their gossip. You might call it mercy. You might call it petty. Maybe both are true. But the last thing I wanted was to become someone who measured victory by how much he took from others. Walter didn't raise me to be a mirror of spite. He raised me to be a math of kindness and stubbornness, to subtract cruelty and multiply possibility. Here's the final line. I didn't inherit a fortune to buy revenge. I inherited a ledger of choices, and I wrote one that refused to be small. I gave away the part of the money that would have made me their puppet and kept the part that allows me to breathe and build. I closed the chapter by opening a dozen other ones for kids who otherwise would have been left with backpacks and bruises. So, what would you do if a family you loved became enemies with your future? Would you take the money and cut them off? Would you expose them? Or would you build something that mattered and let the world decide whether you were brave or foolish? If this hit something inside you, anger, relief, or an ugly recognition, tell me in the comments. I read every one. If you liked the story, like the video. If you want more raw endings and quiet revenges, subscribe and ring the bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes winning looks a lot like giving. Walter gave me a letter that told me to not let anyone tell me my worth. I lived by it. I still do. And every time I see a kid clutching a backpack too heavy for their shoulders, I remember why I picked a different kind of victory.